6 years. That's how long Maegor the Cruel sat the Iron Throne. And in those 6 years, he changed Westeros forever. Not through conquest, but through terror. When a king rules by fire and steel alone, when mercy becomes weakness and cruelty becomes law, what becomes of the realm? Let's walk through the reign of the king. Westeros wishes it could forget, and discover why we never will. It begins not with Maegor's birth, but with his brother's death, and a crown seized in the shadow of Dragonstone. But to understand Maegor's cruelty, we must first understand the weakness that came before. We must understand the king who ruled with kindness when the realm needed strength. We must understand Ennis, the brother who cast the shadow Maegor would step into. Aenys Targaryen was born in the year 7 after Aegon's conquest, the first Targaryen prince born on Westerosi soil. His mother was Rhaenys, the gentler of Aegon, the conqueror's 2 sister wives, the one who loved music and laughter. But Rhaenys died in Dorne when Aenys was just a boy, struck down by a scorpion bolt while riding her dragon Meraxes. The realm mourned her. Aenys never truly recovered. He grew up sickly and weak, prone to stomach troubles and fainting spells, where his younger half-brother Maegor was strong and fierce even as a child. Aenys was soft and timid. Aegon the Conqueror loved both his sons, but he worried about Aenys. A weak king invites rebellion, and Aegon had not conquered 6 kingdoms just to watch them slip away under a gentle hand. Still, the law was clear. Aenys was the eldest son. When Aegon the Conqueror died in 37 AC, Aenys inherited the Iron Throne. He was 30 years old and had never wanted to be king. He ascended the throne with good intentions and a kind heart, and both would nearly destroy the realm. The first years weren't terrible. Aenys was generous and forgiving. He pardoned rebels and welcomed former enemies to court. He threw grand feasts and tourneys. The people liked him well enough. But kindness is not the same as strength, and the realm began to test him. The trouble started when Ennis announced his son's marriage. Prince Aegon, his eldest boy, would wed his own sister Rhaena. The faith of the 7 erupted in fury. The High Septon denounced it as sin and abomination. Brother-sister marriage was the old Valyrian way. True, Aegon the Conqueror had married both his sisters, but the faith had tolerated that only because Aegon had dragons and an army. They would not tolerate it from weak Aenys. The warriors' sons and poor fellows rose in rebellion. These were holy warriors, knights and common men who fought in the name of the 7. They called themselves the Faith Militant, and they declared Aenys's children abominations, who must not be allowed to live. The High Septon himself declared that Aenys was unfit to rule. Aenys didn't know what to do. He tried negotiation. He tried compromise. He begged the High Septon to see reason. None of it worked. Rebels attacked travelers on the roads. Poor fellows gathered in mobs outside castles. Warriors' sons occupied the sept built on Rhaenys' Hill in King's Landing. The Faith Militant grew bolder every day, and Aenys grew weaker. His brother Maegor watched all of this from Dragonstone. Maegor had been named Prince of Dragonstone when Aenys became king, and he ruled the island fortress with an iron fist. He had married Cerys Hightower at 13 in a political match arranged by Aenys, but after years of marriage, Cerys had not given him a single child. Maegor wanted a son. He wanted an heir. So he decided to take a second wife, as his father had done. Ennis forbade it. The Faith was already furious about Prince Aegon's marriage to Rhaena. Another polygamous marriage would push them over the edge. Maegor didn't care. He wed Alice Haraway in a secret ceremony on Dragonstone with only his mother Visenya as witness. When Aenys found out, he had no choice. The High Septon demanded Maegor be punished. Aenys, desperate to appease the Faith, stripped Maegor of his titles and lands and sent him into exile. Maegor took Alice and Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel sword that had been his Aunt Rhaenys's, and flew on Balerion across the narrow sea to Pentos. He became a sellsword captain there, hiring himself and his dragon out to the highest bidder. For 5 years he stayed away, growing harder and more bitter with each passing season. Meanwhile, Westeros burned. The Faith Militant spread across the realm. They attacked any lords who supported Aenys. They preached in the streets that the dragons were demons and the Targaryens were false kings. Prince Aegon and Princess Rhaena fled King's Landing with their infant daughters, seeking shelter in the Westerlands. But even there, poor fellows surrounded Crakehall Castle where they hid, trapping them inside. Aenys fell ill. Some said it was poison. Others said it was simply fear and exhaustion, that his weak body finally gave out under the weight of a crown he'd never wanted to wear. He took to his bed in Dragonstone in the year 42 AC. His wife Alyssa Velaryon stayed by his side. His mother-in-law, the proud Queen Visenya, came to visit. She looked at her stepson with cold eyes and saw what everyone else saw, a dying king who had failed his realm. For days, Aenys lingered between life and death, sweating and shaking, calling out in fevered dreams. The maesters did what they could, but there was no cure for a broken spirit. On the 7th day of his illness, King Aenys I drew his last breath. He was 35 years old. He had ruled for 5 years and left behind chaos. Queen Visenya didn't wait for the funeral. She didn't stay to comfort Alyssa or the children. The moment Aenys died, she knew what had to be done. The realm needed a strong king now, not another gentle one. It needed fire and steel, not songs and smiles. It needed Maegor. She mounted Vhagar in the courtyard of Dragonstone, while Aenys's body still lay warm in his chambers. The great bronze dragon spread her wings, and they flew east into the rising sun, across the narrow sea to Pentos. Visenya didn't ask anyone's permission. She didn't send ravens or hold councils. She went to get her son, the son who should have been king all along. This is the world Maegor returned to, a realm torn by religious war, a faith militant that had tasted blood and wanted more, a people who had learned that kindness could be exploited, and a throne that sat empty waiting for someone strong enough to claim it. Aenys had tried to rule with love. Now it was time to rule with fear. When King Aenys died in 42 AC, the crown should have passed to his son. It didn't. Aenys's eldest son was also named Aegon, after his grandfather the Conqueror. He was 19 years old, married to his sister Rhaena, and already a father to twin baby girls. By every law Aegon the Conqueror himself had written, the throne belonged to Aegon the Younger. But laws are just words written on paper. Dragons are flesh and fire and scale, and Visenya had both the will and the dragon to rewrite those laws. Maegor landed on Dragonstone 5 days after his brother's death. He came on Balerion the Black Dread, the largest dragon the world had seen since before the doom of Valyria. When Balerion's shadow passed over the castle, everyone looked up. They knew what it meant. When Maegor dismounted in the courtyard, his mother was waiting with the crown. The throne room of Dragonstone is carved from volcanic stone, dark and ancient. Torches burned along the walls. Lords and knights gathered, uneasy, uncertain. Some had come to pay respects to dead King Aenys. Others had come to see what would happen next. All of them watched as Queen Visenya Targaryen walked to the center of the hall carrying the iron and ruby crown of Aegon the Conqueror. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't hold a vote or seek counsel. She simply placed the crown on Maegor's head and proclaimed him king. "Behold Maegor of House Targaryen. First of his name," she said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, your king." One by one, the lords and knights present dropped to their knees. Some did it eagerly, believing Westeros needed a strong king. Others did it reluctantly, afraid of Visenya's wrath or Balerion's fire. But they all knelt and called Maegor king. All except one. Grand Maester Gawain was an old man, stooped and gray, but his voice was firm. He stepped forward from the crowd, his chains clinking, and said that according to the laws of succession established by Aegon, the Conqueror himself, Aenys' son Aegon was the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. The crown should pass from father to son. That was the law. The hall went silent. Everyone looked at Maegor. The new king stood slowly. He was tall and broad, built like a warrior, with his mother's sharp features and his father's cold eyes. He wore black armor, even though there was no battle. Blackfire, the Valyrian steel sword of kings, hung at his hip. He looked at Grand Maester Gawain for a long moment, as if considering his words carefully. Then Maegor spoke. "The Iron Throne will go to the man who has the strength to seize it." He drew Blackfire in one smooth motion. The blade seemed to drink the torchlight, shimmering dark red and black. Grand Maester Gawain opened his mouth to respond, but he never got the chance. Maegor swung. The blade cut through the old man's neck cleanly. His head fell to the floor and rolled across the stone. His body crumpled after it. Blood pooled, black in the torchlight. No one else objected. Maegor sheathed his sword and sat back down. "Any other questions about the succession?" he asked. There were none. He had made his position clear. This would not be a reign of laws and debates. This would be a reign of steel and fire. Anyone who challenged him would meet the same fate as the Grand Maester. The next day, 2 dragons descended on King's Landing. Citizens poured into the streets, pointing at the sky. Some cheered, thinking King Enos's brother had come to help fight the Faith Militant. Others screamed and ran for cover. The warriors' sons, 700 knights in silver armor with rainbow cloaks, had barred the city gates weeks ago. They controlled the sept on Rhaenys' hill and much of the surrounding area. They thought they were safe behind walls and faith. Maegor didn't land inside the city. He flew to Visenya's hill on the opposite side of King's Landing from the Faith Militant's position and raised his banner there, the 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen, red on black. Thousands of people flocked to him. Some were loyal to the crown. Others were just tired of the Faith Militant controlling their city. Within hours, Maegor had an army. His mother Visenya dismounted from Vagar and walked through the crowd. She was nearly 60 years old, but still straight-backed and fierce. She climbed onto a wagon so everyone could see her and proclaimed Maegor the true king. "He is blood of Aegon the Conqueror, who was my brother, my husband, and my love," she called out. "If any man questions my son's right to the Iron Throne, let him prove his claim with his body. Let the gods decide." It was a challenge the Faith Militant could not ignore. They were holy warriors who believed the Seven gave strength to the righteous. They believed Maegor was a usurper and an abomination. If they refused to fight, they would lose all credibility. So their captain, Sir Daemon Morrigan, led his men across the city to Visenya's hill. 700 knights in silver armor marched through the streets of King's Landing. People pressed against walls and peered from windows, watching. The warriors formed ranks at the base of the hill, shields locked, swords drawn. They looked up at Maegor standing beside Balerion. The dragon was so large, his shadow covered half the hillside. Sir Daemon Morrigan rode forward on a white horse. He was called Daemon the Devout, and he'd spent his whole life preparing to defend the faith. He looked up at Maegor and called out a challenge. "Let us not fight with dragons and armies," he said. "Let us settle this as our ancestors did in the hills of Andalos. 7 champions for each side. The gods will grant victory to the righteous. A trial of 7. Ancient, sacred, and bound by honor." Maegor looked down at the knight. He could have said no. He could have ordered Balerion to burn them all where they stood. Instead he smiled, thin and cold. "Agreed," he said. "Choose your 7. 7 against 7. Maegor had Blackfire, but he stood alone, until a simple soldier named Dick Bean changed everything. The problem was obvious to everyone watching. Maegor's brother Ennis had taken the Kingsguard with him when he fled King's Landing weeks before. Those elite knights were on Dragonstone, or scattered across the realm. Maegor had no sworn brothers, no famous champions, no legendary warriors at his side. He had sellswords and household guards, common men who'd flocked to his banner because they were hungry or angry or desperate. None of them were heroes. Maegor stood in the center of his army and called out, "Who will stand beside your king?" His voice carried across the hill, but the answer was silence. Men looked at each other. They looked at the 7 warriors' sons waiting below, the finest knights the faith could offer. To step forward meant almost certain death. These weren't criminals or rebels. These were trained killers who believed the gods themselves fought through their swords. The silence stretched. Maegor's face darkened. His mother Visenya watched from beside Vagar, her expression unreadable. The Faith Militant began to laugh and jeer. They thought Maegor had no one willing to die for him, that his support was shallow, that he would be forced to back down. Then a man pushed through the crowd. He wasn't wearing armor, just a leather jerkin and plain brown cloak. He wasn't even a knight, just a man-at-arms, a simple soldier who'd served the crown his whole life. His name was Dick Bean, and he was 30 years old with a wife and 2 daughters in the city. Dick Bean walked up to Maegor and knelt. "I've been a king's man since I was a boy," he said, his voice steady despite the fear everyone could see in his eyes. "I mean to die a king's man." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the crowd erupted. Dick Bean's bravery broke the spell of fear that had held everyone frozen. If a common soldier could stand beside his king, then knights could too. Men pushed forward, calling out their names, offering their swords. Bernard Brune came first. He was a knight who'd served under Aegon the Conqueror himself, an older man now, but still strong. Years ago he'd killed Harren the Red in single combat when that rebel lord tried to claim the ruins of Harrenhal. Everyone knew his name. When Bernard Brune knelt beside Dick Bean, it meant something. 4 more men followed. Sir Bram of Blackhole, a hedge knight with a scarred face and a reputation for never backing down from a fight. Sir Rayford Rosby, a young lord eager to prove himself. Sir Guy Lothston, called Guy the Glutton for his enormous appetite and even more enormous size. He was nearly 7 feet tall and broad as a bull. And Sir Lucifer Massey, Lord of Stonedance, who brought with him the honor of an ancient and proud house. 7 men stood before Maegor. None of them were the greatest warriors in Westeros. None of them had won famous tourneys or earned legendary names. But they were willing to fight, and that was enough. Maegor looked at each of them in turn, then nodded. He drew Blackfire and took his place at their center. The Faith Militant chose their champions carefully. Sir Daemon Morrigan led them, the grand captain of the warriors' sons, called Daemon the Devout. Beside him stood Sir Lyle Bracken, heir to Stonehenge, one of the finest swordsmen in the Riverlands. There was Sir Harris Horp, called Death's Head, Harry for the Scully War painted on his shield. Sir Aegon Ambrose from the Reach, Sir Dickon Flowers the Bastard of Beesbury, Sir William the Wanderer, who'd fought in a dozen foreign wars, and Sir Garibald of the Seven Stars, whose shield bore the symbol of the faith. These were not simple soldiers. These were champions, each one chosen by the faith as a righteous warrior. They believed the gods fought through them. They believed they could not lose. Queen Dowager Visenya raised her hand. The crowd fell silent. Both groups of fighters took their positions on the hillside, forming a rough circle. Maegor and his 6 companions on one side, the 7 warrior sons on the other. Visenya looked at both groups, then dropped her hand and called out one word. Begin! Steel rang against steel. Men shouted war cries and curses. The battle was chaos. 14 men swinging swords and axes, shields splintering, blood flying. Dick Bean died first. He lasted perhaps 30 seconds before Sir Lyle Bracken cut him down with a blow that nearly split him in half. The soldier fell without a sound, his courage spent in those few moments of defiance. But his bravery had already done its work. He'd inspired the others to stand, and now they fought like men possessed. Sir Bram of Blackhole faced Death's Head Harry in a furious exchange of blows. Both men were bleeding within minutes, but neither would back down. Bernard Brune, the old warrior, moved with the efficiency of long experience, his sword finding gaps in armor that younger men would have missed. Sir Guy Lothston used his enormous size to batter through defenses, his warhammer crushing a warrior son's shield and the arm behind it. But the Faith's champions were equally skilled. Sir William the Wanderer was a whirlwind of motion, his blade seeming to be everywhere at once. Sir Aegon Ambrose fought with the precision of a master swordsman, each strike calculated and deadly. Men fell on both sides, blood soaked into the ground. The crowd watching from the hillside stood frozen, barely breathing. Maegor fought in the center of it all, Blackfire in his hands. The Valyrian steel blade was lighter than normal steel and held an edge that could cut through armor like cloth. Maegor was larger and stronger than most men, trained since childhood by the best weapons masters in Westeros. He moved through the melee like a storm, killing 2 warrior sons in the first minute. Slowly, terribly, his side began to win. Sir Rayford Rosby died when Sir Garibald's sword found his throat. But Sir Garibald died moments later when Bernard Brune drove a dagger under his arm into his heart. Sir Guy Lothston fell to Sir Aegon Ambrose, but not before crushing Sir Dickon Flower's skull with his warhammer. One by one, the warriors fell until only 3 men remained standing. Maegor faced Sir Daemon Morrigan and Sir William the Wanderer. Both of them were wounded, bleeding from a dozen cuts, but they stood firm. They were the Faith's finest, and they would not yield. Daemon the Devout raised his sword and called out to the 7, asking for strength. Sir William circled to Maegor's left, trying to flank him. They attacked together, 2 legendary warriors against 1. Blackfire met their blades with a sound like thunder. Maegor was faster than they expected, stronger than seemed possible. He blocked William's strike and countered. the Valyrian steel cutting through the man's armor into his side. William staggered but kept fighting, wounded but determined. Daemon pressed the attack from the other side, his blade scoring a deep cut across Maegor's shoulder. Blood ran down Maegor's arm, but he didn't slow. He spun and caught Sir Daemon's next strike on Blackfire, then twisted the blade and thrust it through a gap in the knight's armor. Daemon the Devout fell to his knees, blood bubbling from his lips, and died with a prayer on his tongue. Only Sir William the Wanderer remained. The old knight was bleeding heavily from his side wound, swaying on his feet, but he raised his sword one more time. Maegor respected that. He didn't taunt or mock. He simply stepped forward and drove Blackfire through William's heart, ending it quickly. As Sir William fell, his sword came down one last time in a final, desperate blow. The blade caught Maegor on the side of his head, right where his helmet met his gorget. The steel cracked through the helmet and struck Maegor's skull. The impact drove him to his knees, then flat on his back. His eyes closed. Blood seeped from under his ruined helmet. He didn't move. The hill went silent. The crowd stared. The remaining warrior sons at the base of the hill tensed, uncertain. Was the usurper dead? Had the gods delivered judgment after all? Then Visenya ran forward. She was a queen and a warrior, and she moved faster than seemed possible for a woman her age. She dropped to her knees beside her son and tore off his helmet with her own hands. The metal was bent and bloody. Maegor's face was pale, his eyes closed, a deep gash across his temple leaking blood into his hair. But his chest moved. Just barely, just slightly, but it moved. Visenya pressed her hand to his throat and felt a pulse, weak but steady. She looked up at the crowd and said in a voice that cut through the shocked silence, "The king breathes. The king lives." The victory was his, but the city held its breath. 700 warrior sons remained armed on a hilltop. Servants and maesters rushed forward to carry Maegor away. The crowd erupted in cheers and prayers, some calling to the seven, others to the old gods. Everyone relieved that the battle was over. Bernard Brune, the only one of Maegor's champions still standing, knelt before Visenya and swore his sword to the new king. She nodded, her face carved from stone, and ordered him to take command of the city watch. But there was still the problem of the 700 warriors' sons. They stood in formation on Rhaenys' hill, watching everything. They'd sent 7 champions to fight for the gods, and the gods had let them die. What did that mean? Was Maegor truly the rightful king, chosen by divine will? Or had he simply been stronger and luckier than his opponents? The warriors' sons didn't know. Their captains argued among themselves. Some wanted to attack immediately, to storm Visenya's hill, while Maegor was unconscious and vulnerable. Others counseled patience, saying the gods had spoken and they should accept the outcome of the trial. A few even suggested they bend the knee, acknowledging Maegor as king. In the end, they chose to wait. They withdrew to their sept and barred the doors, praying for guidance. And they waited to see if Maegor would wake up, and what he would do if he did. For 27 days, Maegor lingered on death's door. The maesters tended him in the Red Keep, cleaning his wounds, feeding him broth when he could swallow, watching for signs of improvement or decline. His skull had been cracked by Sir William's final blow. Pieces of bone had been driven into his brain. The maesters did what they could, but mostly they just waited and prayed. Meanwhile, across Blackwater Bay, on the island of Driftmark, Dowager Queen Alyssa Velaryon made her own move. She proclaimed her son Aegon as the true king, saying Maegor was a usurper who'd stolen the crown through violence. But her voice barely carried past her own castle. Most lords didn't want to get involved in what looked like a religious civil war. Young Prince Aegon remained trapped at Craighall in the Westerlands, surrounded by poor fellows, who called him an abomination for marrying his sister Rhaena. The poor fellows were even more dangerous than the warriors' sons. While the warriors' sons were trained knights with rules and organization, the poor fellows were common people with clubs and farming tools and righteous fury. There were tens of thousands of them scattered across Westeros, and they all believed the Targaryens were sinners who needed to be punished. Now they began to march on King's Landing. From the west came thousands following a hedge knight named Horus Hill. From the south came even more following a giant of a man called Wat the Hewer, who carried an axe as tall as a child. The poor fellows who'd been surrounding Craighall left to join the march, and Prince Aegon and Princess Rhaena were finally able to slip away. They fled to Casterly Rock. where Lady Jocasta Lannister realized that Rhaena was pregnant with Aegon's children. All of this happened while Maegor lay unconscious. The realm held its breath. If he died, the succession would be thrown back into chaos. Aegon could claim the throne, but so could Alyssa's younger sons, Viserys or Jaehaerys. The lords would have to choose, and that choice would probably lead to war. On the 28th day after the Trial of Seven, a ship arrived from Pentos. The ship was a merchant vessel, broad and slow, but it carried a cargo more valuable than silk or spices. 2 women stepped onto the dock at King's Landing, accompanied by 600 sellswords from Pentos. The first woman was Lady Alice Haraway, whom Maegor had married in secret years before during his exile. She had golden hair and a sweet smile, the daughter of Lord Lucas Haraway of Harrenhal. She'd stayed behind when Visenya brought Maegor home, but now she'd come to stand beside her husband. The second woman was a mystery. She was pale and slender with hair as black as a raven's wing. She wore the clothes of Pentoshi nobility, silks and jewels, but her eyes were strange, too knowing, too old for her young face. People whispered about her immediately. Some said she was Maegor's mistress. Others claimed she was Alice's companion and lover. A few muttered that she was a witch from the Shadowlands beyond Ashai. Her name was Tyanna, just Tyanna. She was called Tyanna of the Tower, though no one knew which tower or why. The rumors about her were dark and terrible. They said she was a bastard daughter of a Pentoshi magister, raised in secret and trained in poisons and dark arts. They said she could speak to rats and spiders, that vermin whispered secrets to her in the night. They said she'd killed 3 men with poison before she was 16, and many more since then. They said she was a sorceress who knew spells from before the doom of Valyria. Whether any of it was true, no one knew. But when Tyanna walked through the Red Keep, people stepped aside. Servants avoided her eyes. Guards made signs against evil when she passed. There was something about her that made everyone afraid. Some quality of menace that hung around her like perfume. Queen Visenya met Alice and Tyanna in the throne room. She looked at these 2 women her son had brought into his life. One young and pretty and sweet, the other pale and strange and frightening, and she made a decision. She dismissed all the Maesters who'd been tending Maegor. She sent them away despite their protests and their oaths as healers. Instead, she gave Maegor over to Tyanna's care. That night, Tyanna locked herself in Maegor's chambers with only Alice to help her. No one knows what she did in there. Some say she used poisons that would have killed a normal man, but somehow shocked Maegor's body back to life. Others claim she performed blood rituals, mixing her own blood with his, and speaking words in languages older than Valyrian. The Septons would later preach that she made a bargain with dark powers, trading her soul, or Maegor's, for his life. Whatever the truth, the next morning something extraordinary happened. 27 days Maegor lingered between life and death. On the 28th, he woke, and the killing began. Just after dawn, as the sun rose over King's Landing, Maegor opened his eyes. He sat up in bed, weak and shaking, his head wrapped in bandages. Alice wept with relief and threw her arms around him. Tyanna watched from the shadows, her expression unreadable. Maegor looked at them both, then pushed himself to his feet. Servants tried to help him, but he waved them away. He was unsteady, his legs trembling after nearly a month in bed, but he walked to the window on his own and looked out at his city. By midday, word had spread through King's Landing that the king had awakened. People poured into the streets, celebrating and cheering. Maegor appeared on the battlements of the Red Keep between Alice and Tyanna, and the crowd roared. He raised one hand, his left hand because his right arm was still weak, and acknowledged them. Then he descended from the battlements, called for his armor, and mounted Balerion. The crowd's cheers faded as they watched the black dread rise into the sky. Where was the king going? What was he about to do? They got their answer soon enough. Maegor flew straight to Rhaenys' hill, where the 700 warriors' sons had been waiting for nearly a month. The knights were at prayer in the Sept of Remembrance when Balerion's shadow fell over them. They looked up through the Sept's windows and saw the dragon circling above, massive and black, blotting out the sun. Maegor didn't offer terms. He didn't demand their surrender or ask them to bend the knee. He simply gave Balerion the command, and the dragon opened his jaws. Dragonfire poured down like a river of light and heat and death. The Sept's wooden roof caught first, bursting into flames so hot they turned white. Then the stone walls began to crack from the heat. The warriors' sons tried to flee, but Maegor had planned for that. Men loyal to him surrounded the Sept's exits with swords drawn. Any knight who made it out of the burning building was cut down before he'd taken 3 steps. The screams of burning men echoed across King's Landing. The smell of roasting flesh hung in the air. Plumes of black smoke rose from Rhaenys' hill and could be seen from every corner of the city. People hid in their homes, terrified, praying this wouldn't be their fate too. The burning went on for hours. By nightfall, the Sept of Remembrance was just rubble and ash and bones. Maegor had made his message clear. This was not a king who would negotiate or compromise. This was not his brother Enos, trying to please everyone and pleasing no one. This was a king who would burn his enemies and anyone who stood with them. The High Septon called down the wrath of the gods. Maegor brought dragonfire. The war between the Iron Throne and the Faith Militant had truly begun, and it would last for the rest of Maegor's reign. The next morning, Maegor sent out ravens to every lord in Westeros. His message was simple: take up arms and rid your lands of the poor fellows, or face the king's justice. Many lords obeyed immediately, eager to show their loyalty and avoid Balerian's wrath. Others hesitated, unwilling to kill holy men, even if those holy men were in rebellion. The High Septon in Old Town responded by calling on all true children of the gods to rise up and defend the faith against the Dragon King and his abominations. The first major battle came at Stonebridge in the Reach. 9,000 poor fellows under the command of Wat the Hewer tried to cross the river Mander. They were marching to join with other groups of poor fellows gathering near King's Landing, planning to lay siege to the city with sheer numbers. But Lord Meadows and Lord Rowan had gathered loyalist forces on both sides of the river. When the poor fellows were halfway across the bridge, the trap was sprung. Knights charged from both sides. The poor fellows were packed onto the narrow bridge with nowhere to run. They fought bravely, these common men with their simple weapons, but they weren't soldiers. They were farmers and craftsmen and laborers who believed in the gods more than they knew how to fight. The slaughter was terrible. Bodies fell into the Mander until the river ran red with blood. For 20 leagues downstream, villagers spoke of red water that stained everything it touched. Wat the Hewer himself fought at the center of the bridge, his great axe cutting down knights in their armor like wheat before a scythe. He was enormous, nearly 7 feet tall, and strong enough to lift a grown man over his head. They say he killed 40 men before he was finally brought down. Even then it took 20 knights working together, and half of them died in the process. When Wat finally fell, he had 14 wounds on his body and was still trying to stand. The Loyalists took Wat alive. They bound him in chains and brought him back to King's Landing as a prize for the king. Maegor looked at the giant warrior, this man who'd led thousands against him, and he ordered the Maesters to remove Wat's limbs one by one. But, and this was the cruel part, Maegor commanded the Maesters to keep Wat alive. They cut off one arm and sewed the wound, then a leg, then the other, arm, then... Each amputation was done carefully, slowly, with healing between each one so Wat wouldn't die from shock or blood loss. The torment took days. Wat the Hewer was alive, limbless, barely conscious from the pain, while Maegor planned his next move. The king wanted this enemy to witness what came next, a wedding. The war continued even as Maegor celebrated. 20,000 warriors of the faith gathered at the great fork of the Blackwater, where the river splits into 3 branches. They'd come from all across the Reach and the Riverlands, a mixture of warriors' sons and poor fellows, the largest army the Faith Militant had assembled. They believed numbers would win the day. If they could defeat Maegor's army in the field, other lords would join their cause, and the Targaryens could be overthrown. Maegor met them with 10,000 loyalist soldiers and 3 dragons. The battle began in the morning and lasted all day. Knights on horseback crashed into ragged lines of poor fellows. Swords rang against clubs and farming tools. Men screamed and died in the mud. By afternoon, rain began to fall, turning the battlefield into a swamp. The smoke from burning tents and siege weapons mixed with the rain to create a thick fog that covered everything. Through the fog came Balerion again and again. Maegor descended on his enemies like a thunderbolt, dragonfire turning whole companies of men to ash in seconds. But the rain dampened some of the flames, and the fog made it hard to see targets. The battle dragged on into the night, both sides exhausted but neither willing to retreat. In the darkness, lit only by scattered fires and the occasional flash of dragonfire. The last of the fighting happened. Maegor won, but barely. Half his army was dead or wounded. The survivors were so tired they could barely stand. The Faith militant was broken as an organized force, their army scattered, but they'd proven they could hurt the dragons. It wasn't the easy victory Maegor had hoped for. When he returned to King's Landing, Wat the Hewer was brought out in a cart to witness the king's triumph. The giant lay there, a torso and a head, kept alive by Meister's skill and Maegor's cruelty. His eyes were still defiant, still burning with faith and fury. Maegor looked down at him and saw something that might have been respect, but respect wouldn't stop what came next. Maegor had declared his intention to take a third wife, Tyanna of the Tower. This was madness by the Faith standards. He already had Cerys Hightower, his first wife, still living in Old Town. He already had Alice Haraway, his second wife, whom he'd married in secret. Now he wanted a third? It was too much. The Faith had tolerated Aegon the Conqueror's 2 wives because he'd conquered the realm. They'd barely tolerated Maegor's second marriage. A third was unforgivable. Only Grand Maester Miros dared speak against it publicly. He stood in the throne room before the assembled court and said, "Your Grace, you have one true wife waiting for you in the High Tower. The Faith will not accept another marriage." His voice shook, but he said it anyway, because someone had to. Maegor listened to him speak. The whole hall listened. When the Grand Maester finished, Maegor stood slowly from the Iron Throne. He descended the steps, Blackfire in his hand. Myro stood his ground, trembling but determined. Maegor walked right up to him, looked him in the eyes, and drove Blackfire through the old man's chest. The blade went in below the ribs and came out through his back. Myros died without another word, his blood spreading across the floor. No one else objected. Maegor wiped Blackfire clean on the dead Maester's robes and announced his wedding would take place in 3 days. The ceremony was held on Rhaenys Hill, right on top of the ruins of the Sept of Remembrance. The ashes and bones had been cleared away, but everyone knew what had happened there. Everyone remembered the screams. Maegor married Tyanna, standing on ground soaked with the blood of 700 holy knights. It took him a dozen septons before he found one willing to perform the ceremony. The others he'd asked all refused, and all were executed for their defiance. Wat the Hewer, limbless in his cart, was forced to watch the wedding. When it was done, Maegor finally gave the order for the man's suffering to end. Wat died with a prayer on his lips, asking the gods to curse Maegor and all his line. Whether the gods listened, no one can say. But Maegor's troubles with heirs and children were only beginning. By this time, Visenya had flown to Driftmark to speak with Alyssa Velaryon. Aenys' widow had been declaring her son Aegon the true king, but she had no army and no support. Visenya convinced her that resistance was futile. Better to bend the knee to Maegor and keep her other children safe than to continue a hopeless fight. Reluctantly, Alyssa agreed. She and her children, Viserys, Jaehaerys, and Alysanne, attended Maegor and Tyanna's wedding. The message was clear. Even the family of King Aenys acknowledged Maegor now. But across the realm, in Casterly Rock, Prince Aegon and Princess Rhaena remained defiant. The faith was broken, but Maegor still had no son, and 3 queens who could not give him one. A king without an heir is a king without a future. Maegor had 3 wives, Cerys, Alice, and Tyanna, and not one living child. Cerys Hightower had been his first wife, the one forced on him when he was just 13 years old. That marriage had been arranged by his brother King Aenys to secure the support of House Hightower and placate the faith of the Seven. Cerys was 5 years older than Maegor, a pious woman who spent most of her time in prayer. She'd moved to Old Town after Maegor went into exile, and she hadn't joined him since his return. In all the years they'd been married, more than 20 now, she'd never been pregnant, not once. Some whispered that Maegor was cursed, unable to father children. Others said Cerys was barren. A few brave souls suggested that Maegor had never properly consummated the marriage, that he'd ignored Cerys from the start because she was forced on him against his will. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. Cerys Hightower would never give Maegor an heir. Alice Haraway had been different. She was young and beautiful, with golden hair and blue eyes. Maegor had chosen her himself during his exile in Pentos, marrying her in secret with only his mother as witness. Alice adored him. She'd stood by him through exile and disgrace. never complaining, always loyal. When she returned to Westeros on that ship from Pintos, she'd been full of hope. She was sure she would give Maegor the son he needed. And for a time, it seemed she would. 3 months after Maegor's wedding to Tyanna, Alice announced she was with child. The realm rejoiced. Finally, the king would have an heir. The nightmare of succession crises could end. Maegor was gentle with Alice during her pregnancy, visiting her chambers every night, bringing her gifts, speaking softly about the boy they would have. He'd already chosen a name, Aegon, for his father, the Conqueror. Maesters examined Alice regularly and pronounced her healthy. The pregnancy seemed normal in every way. Alice glowed with happiness. She spent her days preparing a nursery, sewing tiny clothes, dreaming of the son she would give her husband. The court began to breathe easier. Maybe the gods weren't as angry with Maegor as everyone feared. Maybe his reign could be legitimate after all, if only he had an heir. When Queen Alice's belly began to swell, the realm rejoiced. Too soon. 3 months into the pregnancy, Alice woke in the night screaming. Pain tore through her belly like knives. She was bleeding heavily, soaking through her bed sheets. Servants ran for maesters. Midwives rushed to her chambers. They found her writhing in agony, her face white with shock and pain. Blood everywhere. The child came too early, far too early. What from Alice's body wasn't a living baby, but something else, something wrong. The boy, could be called a boy, was twisted beyond recognition. His limbs were bent at impossible angles, his spine curved like a bow. His head was enormous, too large for his malformed body. And where his eyes should have been, there was only smooth skin. He'd never had eyes at all. The thing never breathed, never moved. It was born dead, if it could even be called being born. The midwives wept. The septas made signs against evil. The maesters looked at each other in horror and confusion. They'd never seen anything like this. Birth defects happened, yes, but this was something else. This was a child shaped by some cruel hand, twisted in the womb by forces no one understood. They brought the thing to Maegor. He was sitting on the Iron Throne, having held court all day, when they placed the small bundle in his arms. He looked down at what should have been his son, his heir, the future of his dynasty. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he roared, a sound of pure anguish that echoed through the Red Keep. This cannot be my son. Grief lasted only moments before fury replaced it. Someone had done this. Someone had cursed his child, or poisoned Alice, or worked some dark magic. This wasn't natural. This wasn't the gods' judgment. This was sabotage, betrayal, witchcraft. And someone would pay. Maegor ordered the immediate execution of everyone who had attended Queen Alice during her pregnancy. The midwives who'd delivered the child, the septas who'd prayed with her, the masters who'd examined her and pronounced her healthy. Even Grand Maester Desmond, who'd served the crown faithfully for 30 years, was dragged before the king and sentenced to death. They died within the hour. Some were given a quick death by sword, others were hanged. A few were given to the flames. By sunset, more than a dozen people were dead, killed on the king's orders because they'd failed to protect his heir. It didn't matter that none of them could have prevented what happened. It didn't matter that they'd done everything right. Maegor needed someone to blame, and they were convenient. Later that night, a servant found Maegor sitting on the Iron Throne alone, long after everyone else had left. The throne room was dark, except for a few torches. The king sat with Grand Maester Desmond's severed head in his hands, staring into its dead eyes as if searching for answers. Blood from the head dripped onto Maegor's lap, onto the throne, onto the floor. He didn't seem to notice. He just sat there in the darkness, holding the head, silent and still. That's where Tyanna found him. She climbed the steps to the throne slowly, her pale face unreadable in the torchlight. She knelt before Maegor, careful not to step in the blood pooling around the throne's base. She waited until he looked at her, then spoke in her soft, strange voice. "Your Grace," she said, "there's something you must know. Something I have learned." She reached into her gown and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. "I have been watching Queen Alice, as you commanded. I have my little friends everywhere, mice and rats and spiders who see things people wish to keep hidden, and they have told me terrible things." Maegor's eyes focused on her. "Speak." Tyanna unfolded the parchment. It was a list of names. 20 men, all of them knights or lords or wealthy merchants. These men, Tyanna said, visited Queen Alice's chambers on the nights you spent with me, or with Queen Cerise. Lord Lucas Haraway, her father, sent them. He was desperate for his daughter to give you an heir, so desperate that he arranged for other men to lie with her in your place. The throne room went very still. Maegor stared at the list. His hands tightened on Grand Maester Desmond's head until his knuckles went white. Tyanna continued, her voice never changing tone. Every man on this list has proven he can father healthy children. Lord Haraway chose them carefully. He thought that if Alice bore a child, any child, you would as your own, and his grandson would one day be king. But something went wrong. The child was twisted, monstrous, and now you know why. The child was a monster, and Tyanna whispered that Alice's betrayal ran deeper than anyone knew. For 3 days, Maegor said nothing. He locked himself in his chambers with only the list of names for company. The court whispered and worried. What would the king do? Would he accept Tyanna's claims? Would he investigate? Would he simply kill everyone and ask questions later? On the 4th day, Maegor emerged. His face was set like stone. He called for the King's Guard and gave them orders. One by one, the men on Tyanna's list were arrested. They were brought to the dungeons beneath Maegor's holdfast, the fortress within the Red Keep that the king had built specifically for moments like this. And there, in those deep dark cells, Tyanna went to work. She was the mistress of Whisperers now, Maegor's spy master and torturer. She had tools and techniques learned in Pentos and Essos, ways of inflicting pain that left men begging for death. One by one, she questioned the men on her list. One by one, they confessed. Under torture, 18 of the 20 admitted they'd lain with Queen Alice. They swore they hadn't wanted to, that Lord Haraway had forced them, that they'd been afraid to refuse the king's hand. But they admitted it nonetheless. Only 2 men refused to confess, even under the worst torments. They died in the dungeons, still claiming innocence. Whether they were truly innocent or simply more stubborn than the others, no one would ever know. When Maegor had his confessions, he moved with terrible purpose. First, he sent the King's Guard to fetch Queen Alice from her chambers. She'd been recovering from the stillbirth, weak and grieving, when armed men burst in and dragged her from her bed. She screamed and begged to know what was happening, but no one would answer her. Then he had her sisters brought to the throne room. Alice had 3 younger sisters, all of them living in the Red Keep under Maegor's protection. They were innocent girls, ages 12 to 17, who'd done nothing wrong. Maegor had them brought before Alice and killed one by one while she watched. The youngest first, her throat cut with a dagger. Then the middle sister, stabbed through the heart. Then the eldest, her head taken off with a sword. Alice's screams echoed through the Red Keep as she watched her sisters die. Next came her father. Lord Lucas Haraway was the king's hand, the second most powerful man in the realm. He'd served Maegor faithfully, or so everyone thought. Now Maegor had him dragged to the top of the Tower of the Hand, the tallest tower in the Red Keep, and thrown from the roof. Lord Lucas's body shattered on the courtyard stones far below. Then Maegor went after every male Haraway he could find. Alice's brothers, her uncles, her cousins, her nephews, anyone with Haraway blood. Some were arrested in their homes, others were hunted down by the King's Guard. All of them were brought to the Red Keep and thrown onto the iron spikes in the dry moat that surrounded Maegor's holdfast. The spikes had been placed there specifically for this purpose, tall iron posts sharpened to deadly points. The Haraway men were impaled on these spikes and left there to die slowly, screaming in agony for hours or days before death finally came. But the worst fate, the absolute worst, Alice herself. Maegor gave her to Tyanna. The mistress of Whisperers took Alice to the deepest dungeon beneath Maegor's holdfast, and there, for a fortnight, she tortured the young queen. No one knows exactly what Tyanna did in those cells. The guards who stood watch outside refused to speak of it afterward. But the screams echoed up from the dungeons, through the Red Keep, out into the city. For 14 nights, the people of King's Landing heard Queen Alice screaming. Maegor was present for all of it. He didn't participate in the torture himself, but he watched. Every day he descended to the dungeons and sat on a chair while Tyanna worked. He watched as if he were keeping vigil over his own heart's darkening. He watched as Alice begged and sobbed and screamed. He watched as she lost her mind from the pain. He watched until finally, on the 14th day, she died. Even then, Maegor wasn't finished. He ordered Alice's body cut into 7 parts, one for each of the 7 gods she'd prayed to who hadn't saved her. Each part was mounted on a spike above one of King's Landing's 7 gates. Her head above the dragon gate, her torso above the iron gate, her limbs above the other 5 gates. They stayed there for weeks, rotting in the sun until ravens came to pick the bones clean. Then Maegor mounted Balerion and flew to Harrenhal. House Harroway's ancestral seat was the largest castle in Westeros, the ruins of Harren the Black's mad dream. The current Lord Harroway, Lucas's brother, lived there with his family and household. When Maegor arrived on his dragon, they barred the gates and prepared to defend themselves. It was pointless. Balerion's flames melted the iron bars on the gates. The walls of Harrenhal were too thick to burn, but the people inside weren't. Maegor descended into the castle courtyard and went from room to room with Blackfire in hand. He killed every person he found with Harroway blood. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. If they had the Harroway name or Harroway blood in their veins, they died. By nightfall, House Harroway was extinct, but Maegor still wasn't done. He flew to Lord Harroway's town, a settlement built around a castle that belonged to a cadet branch of House Harroway. The town had perhaps 2,000 people living in it. Maegor circled overhead on Balerion and burned it. Not just the castle, the entire town. Every building, every street, every shop and home and sept. The people who fled into the fields were hunted down by Maegor's soldiers. By the time the sun set, Lord Harroway's town was ash and smoke and corpses. House Harroway was gone, erased from history like smoke in the wind. The realm wept, not for the Harroways, but for itself. What kind of king does this? What kind of man exterminates an entire noble house, kills babies and children, burns towns full of innocent people? The realm had never seen anything like it. Even during the conquest, Aegon the Conqueror had shown mercy to those who bent the knee. He'd been harsh, yes, but not like this. Never like this. People began to whisper that Maegor wasn't just cruel. He was cursed. Or perhaps he was cursing himself with every atrocity. The gods would surely punish him for what he'd done. And maybe they already were. Because despite having 3 wives and lying with all of them, Maegor still had no living heir. When Maegor returned to King's Landing after the Harroway extermination, more troubling news awaited. His mother Visenya had died on Dragonstone. She was nearly 70 years old, and her death wasn't unexpected, but it still hit Maegor hard. Visenya had been his champion since birth, the one who believed in him when everyone else favored his brother Aenys. She'd crowned him. She'd defended him. She'd burned half the Riverlands in his name. Now she was gone. Maegor had her body burned in the Targaryen tradition, her ashes placed in an urn beside Aegon the Conqueror's, in the crypts beneath Dragonstone. He spent 3 days alone in the crypts, speaking to her shade, promising he would fulfill her dreams of a strong Targaryen dynasty. But without Visenya's counsel, Maegor seemed to lose whatever restraint he'd had left. Then came worse news. On the night Visenya died, Dowager Queen Alyssa managed to escape Dragonstone with Aenys' children, Jaehaerys and Alysanne. They'd been kept there as hostages to ensure Alyssa's cooperation, but with Visenya gone and the island in mourning, security had slipped. Alyssa took her children and fled on Dragonback. She took the Valyrian steel sword Dark Sister and 2 dragons, Vermithor and Silverwing. The young dragons had bonded with Jaehaerys and Alysanne, children barely into their teens, and now they were gone beyond Maegor's reach. Maegor still held Aenys' other son, Prince Viserys. The boy was 15 years old and had been serving as Maegor's squire, a hostage dressed up as an honor. When Maegor discovered that Alyssa had escaped, he was furious. He had Viserys brought to the dungeons and demanded to know where his mother and siblings had gone. Viserys didn't know. Alyssa had been smart enough not to tell him her plans, knowing Maegor might torture him for information. But Maegor didn't believe that. He gave Viserys to Tyenna, and for 9 days, the mistress of Whisperers questioned the boy. Viserys was brave. He endured the pain, and kept insisting he didn't know. Finally, on the 9th day, his heart gave out. He died still claiming ignorance, still loyal to his mother even in death. Maegor had Viserys' body left in the courtyard of the Red Keep for a fortnight. Let his mother come and claim him. The king said. But Alyssa never came. She was in hiding somewhere, protecting her 2 remaining children, and she wouldn't risk their lives even to bury her dead son. The people of King's Landing wept for Prince Viserys. He'd been a sweet boy, kind and gentle like his father Aenys, beloved by everyone who knew him. His death turned even more of the realm against Maegor. Lords who'd stayed neutral began to wonder if they were safe. If Maegor would kill his own family, would he hesitate to kill anyone? In 45 AC, the construction of the Red Keep was finally complete. Maegor threw a feast for all the builders, carpenters, stonemasons, and laborers who'd worked on the great castle. For 3 days, they were given the finest food and wine, entertained by musicians and singers, celebrated as heroes of the realm. They'd built something that would last 1,000 years, a castle worthy of kings. They were proud of their work. They deserved the celebration. On the 4th day, Maegor had them all executed. Every man who'd worked on the Red Keep died that day. Some were poisoned at breakfast. Others were ambushed by guards and put to the sword. A few tried to flee and were hunted down by Maegor's soldiers. By sunset, they were all dead. Hundreds of men whose only crime was knowing the secrets of the castle they'd built. You see, Maegor had designed the Red Keep with hidden passages, secret doors, and tunnels that connected different parts of the castle. He'd built traps and escape routes and spaces where he could move unseen. These secrets were his alone, and he would not risk anyone else knowing them. The builders had to die so the secrets would die with them. Their bones were buried beneath the stones they'd laid, a foundation of death for a king who ruled through fear. The Red Keep stood complete, beautiful and deadly, a monument to paranoia and power. And within it, in the fortress called Maegor's Holdfast, the king sat alone, surrounded by secrets and ghosts. Not long after, Queen Sarah's Hightower died in Old Town. She'd been ill for months, growing weaker and weaker, and finally her heart simply stopped. Some whispered it was poison sent by Tyanna, who wanted to eliminate her rivals for the king's attention. Others said it was a broken heart from years of being married to a man who despised her. The truth died with Caris. Maegor was left with only 2 queens now. Tyanna, whom everyone feared, and Alice. But wait, Alice was dead too, tortured and dismembered. So Maegor had only Tyanna, 1 queen, 1 wife, and still no heir. But there was another claimant to the throne, a boy with a dragon, hiding in the Westerlands, waiting for his moment. In 43 AC, the rightful heir came home. He came with a dragon, an army, and fire in his heart. Quicksilver against the Black Dread. Prince Aegon the Uncrowned had been in hiding for 2 years, trapped in the Westerlands, surrounded by enemies, unable to claim the throne that was rightfully his. He'd watched his father die. He'd watched Maegor seize the crown through violence. He'd watched the realm descend into chaos and bloodshed. And he'd done nothing, because he couldn't. He had no army, no support, and no dragon. But that changed. With Maegor gone from King's Landing for months, waging war against the Faith Militant and burning castles across the Reach, Aegon saw his opportunity. He and his wife Rhaena made a desperate plan. They would sneak into the capital, claim the dragons that had been left in the dragon pit, and fly away before anyone could stop them. It was madness, but it was their only chance. They disguised themselves as peasants and hid beneath sacks of corn in a wagon pulled by mules. They entered King's Landing through the river gate, passed right through the city streets while guards watched without recognizing them, and made it to the dragon pit on Rhaenys' hill. Rhaena went to Dreamfire, the dragon she'd bonded with years before. Aegon approached Quicksilver, his father's dragon, smaller and younger than the great beasts of the conquest, but still formidable. They were helped by friends within Maegor's own court, lords and knights who'd grown disgusted with the king's cruelties and longed for a return to the gentler days of King Aenys. These men had been working in secret, passing messages, planning rebellion. They arranged for guards to be elsewhere, for doors to be unlocked, for dragons to be unchained. They risked their lives to give Aegon this chance. The prince and princess entered King's Landing in a wagon pulled by mules. They left on dragonback, flying side by side toward the Westerlands. Word spread through the city immediately. Prince Aegon had come and gone like a ghost, taking his dragon and his hope with him. Aegon flew to castles and holdfasts throughout the west, descending from the sky on Quicksilver to denounce his uncle as a tyrant and usurper. He called on all honest men to join his banners and restore the rightful line. And they came. 15,000 men rallied to Aegon's cause. They came from the Westerlands, still angry about Maegor burning their lord's castles. They came from the Riverlands, grieving for House Harroway and all the others Maegor had destroyed. They came because they were tired of terror and wanted mercy again. Lord Lyman Lannister of Casterly Rock was too smart to commit fully. He lent Aegon 500 men under the command of his bastard brother, Sir Tyler Hill. That way, if Aegon won, the Lannisters could claim they'd supported him. If Maegor won, Lord Lannister could say his bastard brother had acted without permission, and he'd had nothing to do with it. Play both sides and survive no matter what. That was the Lannister way. No great lords openly declared for Aegon, but Tyanna's spies brought word that Storm's End, the Eyrie, Winterfell, and Casterly Rock had all been in secret communication with Aegon's mother, Alyssa Valerian. These great houses were waiting to see if Aegon could win a battle. Give them a victory, and they might join his cause. But first, Aegon had to prove he could fight. Maegor made sure he never got that chance. Lord Tully of Riverrun marched west with 5,000 men. Lord Harroway, before his house was exterminated, had sent forces from Harrenhal. Sir Davos Darklyn of the Kingsguard led the king's own soldiers. From the Reach came Lords Peake, Merryweather, and Caswell with their own armies. Aegon was surrounded on all sides, enemies closing in like wolves around a wounded deer. His advisors begged him to divide his forces, to strike each enemy army separately before they could unite. It was the smart strategy, the only way to win against such overwhelming numbers, but Aegon refused. He wouldn't split his strength. He wouldn't run and hide. He would march straight for King's Landing, break through whatever army stood in his way, and claim the throne that was his by right. It was brave. It was noble. It was exactly the kind of thing his father Innis might have done. And it was foolish. South of the God's Eye, that great lake in the heart of the Riverlands, Aegon found Ser Davos Darklyn's army blocking the road to King's Landing. Behind him, Lords Merryweather and Caswell were advancing from the south. To his north, Lords Tully and the remaining Harroway forces were closing in. Aegon was trapped. His only hope was to punch through Darklyn's force before the others arrived, and caught him between them like a nut in a cracker. So Aegon commanded his men to charge, 15,000 warriors screaming battle cries, rushing forward with swords and spears and desperate courage. And at their head, mounted on Quicksilver, flew Prince Aegon the Uncrowned, leading his army like the hero he wanted to be. But heroes don't always win. Sometimes the dragons are just too big. For the first time since Valyria fell, dragon fought dragon in the sky. Aegon rose into the air on Quicksilver, breathing fire on Ser Davos's forces, scattering them like ants. The soldiers on the ground stopped fighting to watch. They'd never seen anything like this. A dragon in battle, flames pouring down, men burning and screaming. For a moment, it seemed Aegon might actually break through. His dragon was swift and agile, darting through the sky like a hawk. His flames were hot enough to melt armor and boil men inside their steel. Then Balerion appeared in the southern sky. The black dread came out of the clouds like a nightmare made real. He was enormous, so much larger than Quicksilver that it barely seemed fair to call them both dragons. Balerion was a mountain with wings. Quicksilver was barely more than a hatchling in comparison, perhaps a quarter of Balerion's size. But Quicksilver was brave, and so was Aegon. They rose to meet the challenge. Quicksilver climbed higher, trying to get above Balerion, to dive down with all her speed and strike before the larger dragon could react. It was a good strategy, but Maegor had been fighting on Dragonback for years. He'd fought in Essos, hiring out as a sellsword, learning every trick of aerial combat. He knew what Aegon was trying to do. Flame met flame as the two dragons circled each other. Quicksilver's silver-white fire blazed hot and bright. Balerion's black-red flames poured out like rivers of death. The armies below stopped fighting entirely now, every man staring up at the sky, watching something that shouldn't be possible. Dragon against dragon. Targaryen against Targaryen. The civil war made in fire and blood. For a few heartbeats, they were equal. Two dragons spinning through the sky, neither able to gain advantage. Then Balerion struck. The Black Dread was older, fiercer, and far larger. He'd been Aegon the Conqueror's dragon, had burned Harrenhal and brought kingdoms to their knees. He'd fought in more battles than Quicksilver had lived years. When Balerion moved, it was with the certainty of a predator who knows he cannot lose. He fell upon Quicksilver from above, his massive jaws closing around the smaller dragon's neck. Quicksilver screamed, a sound like tearing metal and dying children that echoed across the battlefield. She tried to twist away, to break free, but Balerion's teeth had found their mark. With one terrible wrench of his neck, Balerion ripped away one of Quicksilver's wings. Quicksilver plunged toward the earth, screaming and smoking, her remaining wing flapping uselessly. Prince Aegon clung to her saddle, trying desperately to control the fall, but there was no controlling it. They fell like a stone, tumbling through the sky. They struck the ground with an impact that could be heard for miles. The earth shook. Dust and smoke rose in a cloud. When the smoke cleared, both dragon and prince were dead. Quicksilver's body lay broken and still, her silver scales already dulling in death. Aegon lay half buried beneath her, his neck snapped from the impact, his father's dream of reclaiming the throne dying with him. Maegor circled overhead on Balerion for a long moment, looking down at what he'd done. He'd killed his nephew. He'd committed kinslaying, one of the worst crimes in Westerosi culture, a sin that marked a man as cursed forever. But if Maegor felt any regret or shame, he didn't show it. He simply flew back to King's Landing to receive the surrender of Aegon's broken army. The battle on the ground had ended as soon as Quicksilver fell. With their prince dead and their dragon gone, Aegon's forces had no more will to fight. They threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Maegor gave them trials. Some of the leaders were executed as traitors. Most of the common soldiers were allowed to take the black and join the knights. Watch. A few lords who bent the knee quickly enough were forgiven and sent home with warnings. But Aegon's wife Rhaena was still alive. She'd remained at Pink Maiden Castle with her twin daughters when Aegon marched to battle. When news reached her that Aegon was dead, she knew she had to run. Dreamfire was smaller than Quicksilver had been, younger and less experienced. If she tried to fight Maegor, she would die just as Aegon had died. So Rhaena did the only thing she could. She fled. She flew to Fair Isle, a small island off the coast of the Westerlands, and House Farman sheltered her there. For nearly a year, the people of Fair Isle watched the eastern sky in dread, expecting Balerion's dark wings to appear any day. But Maegor never came. Perhaps he thought Rhaena wasn't a threat without an army. Perhaps he was content to have killed one nephew and didn't need to kill more family. Or perhaps he simply had other problems to deal with. Aegon was gone, but Rhaena still lived. And she had daughters. The problem of heirs consumed Maegor. He'd killed his nephew to secure the throne. But what good was a throne if he had no son to inherit it? He was now in his 40s, still strong, still in his prime. But time was passing, and he had no living children. Cerise was dead. Alice was dead. Tyanna remained, but she'd confessed to poisoning Alice's child, so Maegor would never lie with her again. He needed new wives, women who could give him sons. Grand Maester Bennifer suggested Lady Clarissa Dane of Starfall in Dorne, a widow known for her beauty and piety. Lord Butterwell offered his sister, a woman who'd already given birth to 7 healthy children with her late husband, proof she was fertile. Lord Celtigar had 2 young daughters, 12 and 13 years old, and offered either or both to the king. Lord Valerian of Driftmark had different advice. He counseled Maegor to send for his niece Rhaena on Fair Isle and marry her. By marrying Rhaena, Maegor could unite their claims, prevent any fresh rebellions from gathering around her, and acquire a hostage against whatever plots Aegon's mother Alyssa might be planning. Plus, Rhaena had already proven she could bear children. She'd given Aegon twin daughters. Maegor considered all these suggestions carefully. Then he made a decision that shocked everyone. He would marry 3 new wives in a single ceremony. Not one wife, not 2, but 3. The first would be Rhaena, as Lord Valerian suggested. Maegor sent word to Fair Isle, and Rhaena understood her duty. She couldn't refuse without putting her daughters at risk. If she stayed in hiding, Maegor would hunt them. Better to comply, to become his queen, and protect her girls from the inside. So Rhaena mounted Dreamfire and flew to King's Landing, leaving her daughters hidden with trusted allies. The second wife would be Lady Jane Westerling, a young widow who'd given her late husband a healthy son, proof she could bear children. Her family was minor, nobility from the Westerlands, loyal but not particularly powerful or wealthy. She had no choice in the matter. When the king commands your presence for a wedding, you come. The third wife would be Lady Eleanor Costane of the Reach. She'd been married to Sir Theo Bowling, a wealthy knight, and had given him 3 strong sons. But Maegor had Sir Theo arrested on charges of conspiring with Aegon's mother, Alyssa Valerion. The charges were probably fabricated. Tyanna could manufacture evidence for anything, but it didn't matter. Sir Theo was beheaded, and 7 days later, his widow was summoned to King's Landing to become the king's bride. They called them the Black Brides, 3 widows wed to a king in a single ceremony. On a warm spring day in 47 AC, Maegor Targaryen took 3 wives in the yard of the Red Keep. Rhaena wore the black and red of House Targaryen. Jane wore the silver and blue of House Westerling. Eleanor wore the black and gold of House Costane. But the people of King's Landing saw only 3 women in mourning, 3 widows forced to marry the man who destroyed their lives. They called them the Black Brides, and the name stuck. After the wedding, Maegor made a proclamation that gave the court hope. He named Rhaena's daughter Aerea as his heir. "Till such time as the gods grant me a son of my body," he announced, "Princess Aerea Targaryen shall be my successor." Aerea was barely 3 years old, hidden away somewhere safe, but now she was heir to the Iron Throne. It was a compromise, a way of uniting Aegon's claim with Maegor's. Of course, this meant Maegor was disinheriting Prince Jaehaerys, King Aenys's last surviving son. Jaehaerys was 12 years old, in hiding with his mother and sister, but he had as much claim to the throne as anyone. By naming Aerea instead, Maegor was saying that Jaehaerys would never be king. The realm took note. Another son of Aenys cast aside, another branch of the family tree cut away. Maegor would allow no rivals. Half a year passed. 2 queens were with child. The realm held its breath and prayed for living sons. Queen Jane Westerling's belly swelled first. The masters examined her regularly and pronounced her healthy. Queen Eleanor Costane became pregnant a few months later. Maegor was attentive to both women, visiting their chambers, asking after their health, doing everything a concerned husband should do. For the first time in years, he seemed almost human, almost kind. Perhaps having 3 wives simultaneously would solve his problem. Surely one of them could give him a living son, but kindness wasn't in Maegor's nature anymore. It had been burned out of him by years of war and betrayal and frustrated dreams, and the gods, it seemed, were not finished punishing him. Queen Jane Westerling went into labor 8 months into her pregnancy. It was too early, but not dangerously so. Many healthy children had been born at 8 months. The masters attended her, and for a day and a night, she labored in her chambers. The pain was terrible. She screamed and wept and begged the gods for mercy. Finally, the child came. It was a monster. The baby had no legs, no arms, and was both male and female. A hermaphrodite with deformed genitals. Its face was twisted, barely recognizable as human. It never drew breath. The midwives wept as they wrapped the dead thing in cloth and showed it to the queen. Jane looked at what she'd brought into the world and began to scream. She screamed until her voice gave out, and then she just lay there shaking, staring at nothing. She died 3 days later from blood loss and fever. The masters said her body had been too damaged by the difficult birth. That infection had set in, that there was nothing they could do. But everyone believed the real cause was simpler. Jane Westerling had died of heartbreak and horror. Before she passed, Tyanna came to her chambers. The mistress of whisperers knelt beside the dying queen and whispered in her ear. No one else heard what was said, but afterward Tyanna went directly to Maegor with a confession. Jane's baby came too early, twisted and lifeless, and Tyanna confessed she had poisoned them all. Tyanna stood before the Iron Throne, before the assembled court, and confessed her crimes. She said she'd poisoned Queen Alice Haraway's child in the womb, causing the monstrous stillbirth that had led to the Haraway extermination. She said she'd poisoned Queen Jane Westerling's child as well, twisting it inside her, ensuring Maegor would have no heir. And she said she would do the same to Queen Eleanor Costane's child, unless Maegor stopped her. Why would she do this? Why would she destroy Maegor's chances of having an heir? The court whispered a dozen theories. Some said Tyanna was jealous, unable to give Maegor children herself, and determined that no other woman would either. Others claimed she was a witch who'd cursed Maegor from the start, that her goal had always been to destroy House Targaryen from within. A few suggested she was working for someone else, another house, another power, another enemy using her as a weapon. Tyanna offered no explanation. She simply stood there, pale and calm, and confessed everything. Then she said, "Your Grace, you may do with me as you wish, but know this, Queen Eleanor's child will be born monstrous just like the others, because I have already poisoned her too. The curse is in her blood now, and there is no cure." Maegor stared at her for a long time. This woman who'd saved his life after the trial of 7. This woman who'd been his spy master and torturer and confidant. This woman who'd whispered secrets in his ear and helped him destroy his enemies. Had she been his enemy all along? Or was she just a weapon he'd sharpened until it turned on him? He drew Blackfire and descended the throne steps. Tyanna knelt before him, unafraid, almost peaceful. She didn't beg or plead or try to defend herself. She simply waited. It's said that King Maegor killed her himself, cutting out her heart with Blackfire and feeding it to his dogs. The throne room was cleared of everyone except the king, the queen, and the dogs. What happened in there, only Maegor knew. But afterward, Tyanna was gone, and the king's dogs had blood on their muzzles. Tyanna had one thing right, though. 6 months later, Queen Eleanor Costane went into labor. The birth was quick, too quick, as if the baby was eager to escape the womb. What came out was worse than anyone had feared. The child was eyeless like Alice's baby had been. Its body was twisted and malformed. And most horrible of all, it had rudimentary wings, small, useless things that looked almost like a dragon's wings but weren't, just flaps of skin and malformed bone where arms should have been. The realm looked at this child and knew beyond doubt, Maegor was cursed. They said the gods had turned their faces from the king. 2 monstrous births, 2 dead mothers, and no living heir. 3 monstrous births, actually, if you counted Alice Haraway's child. 3 times Maegor's queens had given birth to things that shouldn't exist, creatures twisted by some dark force no one understood. Whether it was Tyanna's poisons, sorcery from the east, or the gods themselves punishing Maegor for his sins, the result was the same. The king would never have an heir. The whispers grew louder throughout Westeros. A cursed king cannot rule. If the gods have turned against him, how can he protect the realm? His reign was illegitimate from the start. He'd stolen the crown from Aegon the Uncrowned, and now the gods were making their judgment clear. Maegor the Cruel was cursed, damned, abandoned by heaven and earth alike. Maegor knew what people were saying. He heard the whispers even in his own court. Lords who'd once supported him began to avoid his presence. Knights who'd sworn to serve him found excuses to return to their own lands. The small folk of King's Landing stayed off the streets when he rode through. Everyone was waiting for him to die, or be overthrown, or just disappear. Anything to end the nightmare his reign had become. On Dragonstone, his mother Visenya was already dead, her ashes resting beside Aegon the Conqueror. Maegor visited her tomb and spoke to her shade, asking for guidance she could no longer give. She'd believed in him so strongly, crowned him herself, defended him against all criticism. Now she was gone, and he faced the realm's hatred alone. Queen Eleanor survived her monstrous childbirth, but she was changed. She never spoke again after seeing what had come from her body. She lived in her chambers in silence, attended by servants who reported she barely ate, barely slept, just stared up at nothing. Some said her mind had broken, others said she was waiting for a chance to strike at Maegor, biding her time, preparing revenge for the husband he'd murdered, and the horror he'd forced her to endure. Then came news that made everything worse. Prince Viserys, Aenys' son, whom Maegor had held as a hostage and then tortured to death. His death had not gone unnoticed. The realm had loved gentle Viserys. They'd wept when he died. And now, years later, they remembered. They remembered that Maegor killed a family. They remembered the torture, the cruelty, the casual murder of an innocent boy. How could such a man ever be blessed by the gods? The masters and septons began to preach about divine judgment. They reminded people of ancient stories where cursed kings brought ruin to their realms. They said that as long as Maegor sat the throne, Westeros would suffer under his curse. Crops would fail. Winters would be harsh. Dragons might fall from the sky. All because one man had offended the gods too deeply to ever be forgiven. Whether the Meisters truly believed this, or whether they were simply trying to undermine Maegor politically, it worked. The idea spread through the realm like wildfire. Maegor is cursed. An accursed king endangers us all. Even Maegor's own lords began to whisper, "A cursed king cannot rule." And across the realm, swords were being sharpened. The tipping point came in 48 AC, the 6th year of Maegor's reign. The faith militant had been mostly destroyed, but small bands of poor fellows still roamed the roads, preaching against the dragons. One such band was led by a woman named Poxy Jane, who'd survived the pox as a child and wore the scars as proof the gods favored her. She gathered followers throughout the Riverlands and the Reach, and wherever she went, crowds gathered to hear her speak. Meanwhile, a man called Septon Moon emerged in the Reach, claiming to be the true High Septon chosen by the gods themselves. He denounced the official High Septon in Old Town as the High Lickspittle, a puppet of the throne with no true faith. Septon Moon roamed from town to town with an army of followers, drawing huge crowds who believed his message. The dragons must fall, and a new age must begin. Lords Lannister and Tully, the most powerful lords in the West and the Riverlands, could have moved against these rebels but chose not to. They didn't openly support Septon Moon or Poxy Jane, but they didn't oppose them either. They simply looked the other way, letting the faith militant rebuild in their lands while they waited to see what would happen. Maegor spent a year hunting down these rebels. He flew from battle to battle on Balerion, burning camps of poor fellows, executing anyone found with a rainbow cloak or rainbow shield. By 46 AC, he'd killed thousands. He returned to King's Landing with 2,000 skulls, which he laid at the foot of the Iron Throne as trophies. The throne room reeked of death, and servants had to carry away the skulls in carts just to clear the space. But killing rebels didn't solve Maegor's real problem. He still had no heir. He'd stopped sleeping with Queen Tyanna before he killed her, refusing to share her bed after she confessed to poisoning his children. Now she was dead. Queen Jane was dead. Queen Cerise had died years ago. Queen Alice had been tortured to death. That left only Queen Rhaena, who despised him and would rather die than bear his child, and Queen Eleanor, who'd gone mad after giving birth to that winged monstrosity. Maegor needed a new wife, someone young and fertile, someone who could finally give him the son he needed. But who would marry him now? What father would give his daughter to a cursed king, knowing she'd likely bear a monster and die in the process? The answer was, no one would willingly. Power is a shadow. When the sun sets, the shadow fades. The end began at Storm's End. Lord Rhaegar Baratheon, the most powerful lord in the Stormlands, had been quietly sheltering Dowager Queen Alyssa Velaryon and her children since they escaped from Dragonstone. He'd kept them hidden for years, protected and safe, waiting for the right moment to move against Maegor. Now, in 48 AC, he decided the time had come. At a great feast in Storm's End, before all the lords of the Stormlands, Lord Rhaegar made an announcement. He revealed that he'd been protecting Queen Alyssa, Prince Jaehaerys, and Princess Alysanne all this time. Then he proclaimed Jaehaerys the true and lawful king of Westeros. The realm had suffered long enough under Maegor's cruelty and curse. It was time for a new king, one who carried the blood of Aegon the Conqueror through King Aenys, one who might restore peace and sanity to Westeros. Prince Jaehaerys was 14 years old. He stood before the assembled lords with Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel sword, in his hand and vowed to end his uncle's reign of terror. His mother Alyssa stood beside him, proud and fierce. His sister Alysanne, just 12 years old, stood at his other side. Together, they looked like hope itself, like the family the realm wished the Targaryens could be. Most importantly, Jaehaerys had dragons. He'd bonded with Vermithor, the great bronze dragon that had once belonged to his grandfather. Alysanne had bonded with Silverwing. When Rhaena heard that her brother was making his move, she mounted Dreamfire and flew to Storm's End to join him. She brought her daughter Aerea, Maegor's declared heir, and the sword Blackfire, which she'd stolen from Maegor's chambers as he slept. 3 dragons against 1. Maegor had only Balerion, Jaehaerys had Vermithor and Silverwing, and Rhaena brought Dreamfire. The odds had turned against the king for the first time. One by one, the great lords bent the knee, not to Maegor, but to a boy of 14, with 2 dragons and hope. Lord Valerian of Driftmark was among the first to declare for Jaehaerys. The Valerians were the traditional admirals of the Targaryen fleet, and they brought the entire royal navy with them when they switched sides. Maegor lost control of the seas in a single day. The Tyrells of Highgarden followed, bringing all the power of the Reach. The high towers of Old Town declared for Jaehaerys. The Redwynes of the Arbor brought their massive fleet. The Lannisters of Casterly Rock, who'd been sitting on the fence for years, finally chose a side and declared for the Boy King. The Arryns of the Eyrie sent word they supported Jaehaerys. The Royces of Runestone did the same. House after house, region after region, they Maegor did it loudly, sending ravens that proclaimed their support for the true king and denounced the usurper. Others did it quietly, simply stopping their tax payments to King's Landing and ignoring Maegor's commands. A few tried to play both sides, sending messages of support to Jaehaerys, while still maintaining a presence at Maegor's court, hedging their bets in case the Boy King failed. But it became clear very quickly that Jaehaerys would not fail. Every day brought news of more lords declaring for him. Every week saw another region slip from Maegor's control. The king's supporters melted away like snow in summer. 2 of Maegor's Kingsguard vanished one night, presumably going over to Jaehaerys. The Grand Maester fled to Pentos, taking important documents and the throne's treasury records with him. Lords who'd served Maegor faithfully for years suddenly remembered urgent business in their home castles and left King's Landing, never to return. Maegor called a war council to plan his response. He'd gathered what remained of his forces, perhaps 4,000 men, mostly sellswords and household guards, no great lords or legendary knights among them. They met in the throne room, a grim and desperate assembly. Outside, the city of King's Landing held its breath, waiting to see what the cursed king would do. The council went poorly from the start. Lord Hayford, one of the few lords still loyal to Maegor, suggested that the king should abdicate. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "you have fought bravely, but the realm has turned against you. You could take the Black, join the Night's Watch, live out your days in honor guarding the wall. It would spare much bloodshed." Maegor stood from the Iron Throne, walked down the steps, and beheaded Lord Hayford where he stood. Blackfire took the man's head off in one swing, just as it had Grand Maester Gawain years before on Dragonstone. The head rolled across the floor. The body collapsed. No one else suggested abdication. But what could Maegor do? He couldn't fight 3 dragons with one, especially not with Balerion aging and Vermithor and Silverwing in their prime. He couldn't raise an army when all the lords had abandoned him. He couldn't buy sellswords when his treasury was empty and his credit worthless. He was trapped in his own castle, a king in name only waiting for the inevitable. The war council continued through the night. Lords argued and debated, trying to find some strategy that might work, but everyone knew it was hopeless. Maegor sat on the Iron Throne and listened to them bicker, his face expressionless, his thoughts unknowable. By dawn, they would be dead. Maegor called his remaining lords to a war council. They met through the night. By dawn, the king would be dead. They found him as the sun rose, pale and still upon the Iron Throne, his blood soaking into the ancient steel. Queen Eleanor Costane came looking for the king in the morning. The war council had ended hours before, the lords departing to their chambers. Maegor had remained in the throne room alone, sitting on the Iron Throne in the darkness. The guards stationed outside the doors hadn't heard anything unusual during the night. No sounds of struggle, no cries for help, just silence. When Eleanor entered the throne room, morning light was streaming through the high windows, illuminating the Iron Throne in a shaft of gold. And there sat Maegor, slumped forward, his hands resting on the throne's arms, his head tilted to one side. At first she thought he was sleeping. Then she saw the blood. His arms had been slashed open from wrist to elbow, both of them, long deep cuts that had severed veins and arteries. The throne's barbs and blades were known to cut careless sitters, but these weren't accidental scratches. These were deliberate wounds, as if someone, or something, had dragged his arms across the sharpest parts of the throne again and again. Blood had poured from these cuts, soaking his sleeves, dripping down the throne, pooling on the floor beneath. But that wasn't what killed him. Another blade had gone through his neck, entering at the side and emerging just beneath his chin. This wound was precise, surgical almost, perfectly placed to sever arteries and ensure a quick death. Whoever or whatever had done this knew exactly where to strike. Maegor the Cruel was dead. There was no doubt about it. His eyes were open and glassy. His skin was pale and cold. He'd bled out hours ago. sometime in the darkness, alone on the throne he'd killed so many to claim. Queen Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't call for guards or cry for help. She simply stood there staring at her husband's body. This man who'd murdered her first husband and forced her to marry him, who'd made her bear a monstrous child that had driven her half mad. She looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and walked away to tell the court. Was it the throne itself that judged him? An assassin slipping through secret passages? Or did the king choose his own end in the darkness? The mystery of Maegor's death has never been solved. Maesters have debated it for centuries, and every theory has supporters and critics. Let's consider them. Theory 1, the Iron Throne killed him. The throne was forged from 1,000 swords by Aegon the Conqueror's dragon Balerion, melted together and shaped into a seat of power. It's said the throne rejects those unworthy to sit it, cutting them with its countless barbs and blades. Maegor had ruled from the throne for 6 years without serious injury. But perhaps, on that final night, the throne itself passed. Judgment. Perhaps it cut him deliberately, punishing him for his crimes, executing him for his cruelty. It's a superstitious theory, but many in Westeros believed it. The Iron Throne has a will of its own, they said, and it found Maegor unworthy. Theory 2, Queen Eleanor murdered him. She had motive. Maegor had killed her first husband and forced her into marriage. She'd borne him a monstrous child and gone half mad from the experience. She was alone with him in the castle, with access to his chambers. And she was the one who found his body. Perhaps she'd crept into the throne room in the darkness, found him sleeping, or drunk, or distracted, and struck. Perhaps she'd used the throne's own blades to make it look like an accident or divine judgment. Perhaps her silence and madness were an act, and underneath she was perfectly sane and coldly vengeful. It's possible. The gods know she had reason enough. Theory 3, the King's Guard did it. There were 2 knights posted at each door to the throne room that night. They would have had to work together and coordinate their timing perfectly, but it could be done. Perhaps they'd grown disgusted with Maegor's cruelties. Perhaps they'd been secretly communicating with Jaehaerys's forces and saw a chance to end the war without further bloodshed. Perhaps they simply realized that serving a cursed king was a path to damnation and decided to save their own souls by removing him. If this is what happened, they took the secret to their graves. Neither knight ever confessed or even hinted at involvement. Theory 4, someone used the secret passages. Maegor had built hidden tunnels and passages throughout the Red Keep, known only to him. But perhaps someone else had learned of them. Perhaps one of the builders had survived the massacre and passed on the knowledge before dying. Perhaps Tyanna had known and told someone before Maegor killed her. Perhaps Maegor had shared the secrets with someone he trusted, and that person betrayed him. Someone could have entered the throne room through a hidden door, killed the king, and left the same way, completely unseen by the guards outside. Theory 5, Maegor killed himself. This is perhaps the most tragic theory, and the one many historians privately believe. Maegor sat alone on the Iron Throne in the darkness, looking at the ruin of his life. His wives were dead or mad. His mother was dead. His heirs were monsters that never lived. The realm had turned against him. His army had abandoned him. 3 dragons were coming to destroy him, and he had no way to win. Perhaps in that moment, Maegor realized that his life had become unendurable. Perhaps he chose to end it on his own terms rather than be defeated in battle or executed as a traitor. He could have deliberately cut his arms on the throne's blades, opening his veins to bleed out. He could have then positioned himself so that a particularly sharp blade pierced his throat. It would have taken courage or desperation, but Maegor had never lacked for either. The truth is, no one knows. The mystery was never solved. All we know is that Maegor entered the throne room alive and left it dead, taking the answer with him to whatever judgment awaited beyond life. The reign of terror was over after 6 years and 66 days. But the lessons and the fear would echo through the halls of Westeros for centuries. When news reached Storm's End that Maegor was dead, Jaehaerys was crowned King of Westeros. He was 14 years old. His coronation was held in the throne room of Storm's End with Lord Rhaegar Baratheon placing the crown on his head. Lords from across the realm attended or sent representatives. The war was over before it truly began. Jaehaerys rode to King's Landing on Dragonback, Vermithor glittering bronze in the sun, with his sister Alysanne on Silverwing beside him. The city gates opened without resistance. The small folk poured into the streets to cheer their new young king, grateful the nightmare was finally over. There was no resistance, no last stand by Maegor's loyalists. Everyone was simply relieved. One of Jaehaerys's first acts was to order Maegor's body burned in the Targaryen tradition, despite many lords who wanted the corpse desecrated as punishment for his crimes. "He was still my uncle," Jaehaerys said, "still blood of the dragon. We will honor that, even if we cannot honor his actions." So Maegor was cremated in the yard of the Red Keep, and his ashes were placed in an urn beside his mother, Visenya, and his father Aegon the Conqueror in the crypts of Dragonstone. Jaehaerys was wise beyond his years. Where his father Aenys had been too weak and his uncle Maegor too strong, Jaehaerys found the middle path. He could be gentle but also firm. He could show mercy but also justice. He listened to counsel but made his own decisions. Over the course of his long reign, 55 years, one of the longest in Westerosi history, he would prove himself one of the greatest kings the Seven Kingdoms ever had. He reconciled with the faith, making peace with the High Septon and formally disbanding the Faith Militant in exchange for the throne's protection of the church. He built roads and infrastructure. He codified laws and established justice systems. He dealt fairly with the lords, neither too harsh nor too lenient. He married his sister Alysanne, and together they had 13 children, finally breaking the curse of infertility and monstrous births that had plagued Maegor. Their dragons, Vermithor and Silverwing, would live for decades, symbols of a peaceful and prosperous realm. But Jaehaerys never forgot his uncle's reign. He kept Maegor's holdfast, standing as a reminder of what happened when a king ruled through fear alone. He made sure the histories recorded everything Maegor had done, the burnings, the tortures, the murders, the cruelties, not to glorify them, but to warn future generations. Let them remember, Jaehaerys told the Ire masters, so it never happens again. And they did remember. For centuries afterward, whenever a king or lord grew too cruel, advisors would whisper, "Remember Maegor." When someone suggested ruling through terror and force alone, wise men would shake their heads and say, "Maegor tried that. It ended with him dead on the Iron Throne after 6 years." The name became synonymous with tyranny, with cruelty, with the kind of king no one wanted to be or to serve. Maegor the Cruel had brought terror to Westeros, yes. But in doing so, he'd also taught the realm an invaluable lesson, that cruelty begets only cruelty, that fear cannot sustain a kingdom, and that strength without mercy is not strength at all. It's just tyranny wearing a crown. The nightmare ended as mysteriously as it began, with blood on the Iron Throne and a king dead in the dawn light. The realm breathed again. Children grew up without fearing dragonfire. The faith rebuilt its septs. The lords returned to governing their lands in peace. Westeros moved forward, scarred but healing. And in the crypts of Dragonstone, in an urn beside his mother, who'd loved him, and his father, who'd built the dynasty he nearly destroyed, the ashes of Maegor the Cruel rested in eternal darkness. His brief and terrible reign finally ended. His name preserved forever as a warning and a curse. 6 years. That's all it took for one man to nearly destroy a dynasty his father had built. And that's why, centuries later, when lords and kings sit the Iron Throne, they remember Maegor. They remember what happens when cruelty becomes law. They remember that the gods, or the throne itself, judge all who sit in that seat of swords. They remember that terror can conquer a kingdom, but it can never hold one. The story of Maegor the Cruel is not a story of triumph. It's a story of failure, of a man who had everything he needed to be great. Strength, dragons, a crown, but lacked the wisdom to use them well. He brought terror to Westeros, and in the end, terror was all he had. No friends, no family, no heirs, no legacy except a name that parents used to frighten children, and a throne soaked with his own blood. Let that be the final lesson. A king who rules only through fear will find that fear turns inward, consuming him from within. The Iron Throne judges all who sit upon it, and it judged Maegor harshly. Whether by its own blades, by an assassin's hand, or by his own desperate choice, the throne took from Maegor what he'd taken from so many others: his life, his dynasty, and his future. The reign of terror ended, but the memory remained, carved into history like words into stone. a permanent reminder of how power corrupts and cruelty fails. Westeros would never forget Maegor the Cruel, and perhaps that, more than anything else, is his true punishment. To be remembered forever, not for what he achieved, but for the horror he inflicted and the lesson his failure taught. Jaehaerys ruled for 55 years. Maegor ruled for 6 years and 66 days. One built a golden age, the other built a nightmare. Both are remembered, but only one is honored. And that makes all the difference.